Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Coast to Coast Hockey. Today, we're going to be talking about everything to do with the New York Rangers. I'm Cameron.
I'm Noel.
And I'm Nick.
Let's get into it.
Looking at the offseason additions that the New York Rangers made this year, they brought in Blake Wheeler, Bonino, and Eric Gustafson, more on those guys later, as well as some depth pieces, Jonathan Quick as a backup, Tyler Pitlick, and others.
On the subtractions front, high octane wingers Vladimir Tarasenko and Patrick Kane have left the team, as well as some depth pieces and backup goaltender Jaroslav Halak.
So as I mentioned earlier, they brought in Blake Wheeler. They signed him to maybe the contract of the offseason. They signed him for 800K for 1 year. He'll be a UFA at the end of it. And he's on the back nine of his career, that's for sure, but he can definitely still be a productive player. His skating's still lacking, but he's still a great passer. And there was some questions about his leadership in Winnipeg. I know they may have left on a sour note, but he's on to a fresh start now, so I don't think there'll be any issues there.
Another one of the bigger rivals for the New York Rangers is Nick Bonino. This was once a guy part of the famous HBK line with Carl Hagelin and Phil Kessel in the Pittsburgh Penguins glory days in the mid 2010s when they won back-to-back cups. And now this guy has sort of bounced around the league to Nashville, to Minnesota, to San Jose, and back to Pittsburgh for 3 games last year, and then now to here to the New York Rangers. This is a guy who will be in the bottom half of the lineup for sure on a 1 year 800K deal similar to Wheeler, and I expect him to provide the same amount of at least a bit of defensive presence, not so much defensive ability, but just sort of be one of the guys around the net, able to help out and be a centerman that could win faceoffs potentially.
Following the trend of veterans brought in for around $800,000 on 1 year deal, uh, the New York Rangers also brought in Eric Gustafson, formerly of the Toronto Maple Leafs and Washington Capitals. He's a a power play specialist and a great puck mover. He's pretty poor defensively, but uh, that's not really why you're acquiring this guy. You're getting him because he puts up points. He had 42 points last year, career high of 60 points a while ago with Chicago. But honestly, this is a guy who stepped in admirably for John Carlson in Washington when he went down with injuries on the first power play unit. And at times in Toronto, he rivaled Morgan Riley for that power play one spot as well. So it'll be interesting to see how they utilize him in New York, as they have Adam Fox, who is one of the better power play defensemen in the NHL. But he'll be a solid depth defenseman for this team. Moving on to the future outlook for the New York Rangers, this is a team who many of their top prospects have graduated out of the prospect pool, but they've got some interesting guys here in Gabriel Perreault, Brennan Othman, and Will Cooley, as well as Zach Jones and Adam Sikora. So some interesting names there. Guy particularly like is Brennan Othman.
And the Rangers have been buyers in previous deadlines. We saw them go after Tarasenko and Kane that the last year's deadline. So they spent some draft capital there, and that is reflected there as you can see on the screen. One thing to note, though, they do have all three of their first round picks. So those again could be moved at this year's deadline as they look to remain competitive.
Now onto the prospect spotlight for the New York Rangers. The 3 prospects that we're going to highlight today are Gabriel Perreault, Brennan Othman, and Will Cooley. The first prospect of note is Gabe Perreault, and this is a player who led the U.S. national development team in points, as you can see there, with an outrageous total of 53 goals in 63 games and 79 assists as well, for 132 points in 63 games. That is almost 2 a game. That's actually more than 2 a game, to be in fact. He was drafted 23rd overall in the most recent draft, and this was thought to be a steal at the time because he did put up totals higher than some comparable guys who were taken before him. But this is a guy who also had some question marks surrounding his overall transition to the NHL. He's got really good skills with the puck, as well as transition speed, as well as puck handling. But this is a guy who might be interested in the defensive side as he grows into an AHL form, because he seems to sort of drift away without the puck, potentially in some points of the game. So in a game that requires you to be good at all ends of the ice, I wonder how he grows. He is also a winger for that matter as well, and another winger in the prospect system is Brendan Othman. This is a guy who you might think is a centerman because of his play style. He plays offensive but gritty style that many fans have been a fan of for a while. This is a 6 foot, 180-pound winger that played in Flint in the OHL last year and now is in the AHL coming this year with the Hartford Wolfpack. Last year, he put up 29 goals and 38 assists split between Flint and Peterborough. He was traded to Peterborough for their run, which caused them to win the OHL championship. So congrats to them. What a great way to end his junior career. And now he moves on to the pro hockey. So he'll play in the AHL this year. And he has a chance to make the NHL team, but it's very unlikely at this point. I expect a year or two in the AHL before he proves himself for the NHL level, for that matter. The third prospect of note is a bit older than the two previously mentioned. This is Will Cooley. He was drafted 60th overall, and there were some concerns about his skating. He is a 6'3", 200-pound player, and he has found his skating to be sort of a detractor to his talent in recent years. But at the same time, he put up 45 points in 69 games last year and was one of the better players on that Hartford Wolfpack team. So with that being said, I can see him being a pro NHLer in the future. I'm just curious to see how long it takes for the New York Rangers to trust him in that role because his skating has not improved year by year. He has just found ways to make it work with the feet that he has.
Just of note, that should say OHL there for Brennan Othman. Sorry about that mistake there. But with that said, moving on to the projected lineup for the New York Rangers going into the next season here. What is a pretty good forward group, even though there were so many high value subtractions from it. The first line projected right now is Chris Kreider, Mika Zibanejad, and Kaapo Kakko. So nice to see Kaapo Kakko hopefully get a opportunity on that first line. This is a guy who, as we'll get into later, hasn't really been afforded much opportunity this far in his career with the New York Rangers. So hopefully that line sticks out of training camp. And then the second line there is pretty elite with Artemi Panarin, Vinny Trocheck, and Blake Wheeler. Really great second line. Sorry, it is interesting that Panarin and Wheeler are both more playmakers than they are scorers. So it'll be interesting to see the dynamic there. And then the third line is Alexis Lafrenière, Philip Hedl, and Jimmy Vesey. So it'll be interesting to see how Lafrenière and Hedl play in a third line role. These are guys on a lot of teams that you'd like to see get more opportunity, but have been kind of held down in the lineup by having more established veterans in front of them this early in their career. And then a solid fourth line there, Barclay Goodrow, Nick Bonino, and Tyler Pitlick. Although a guy like Goodrow might be a slightly overpaid, I'd say an elite fourth liner in the NHL at this point in his career. So great guy to have there. And then some good depth additions in Bonino and Pitlick that they brought in this offseason.
Moving on to the projected defensive pairs for the New York Rangers. We first have the notable pair of Ryan Lindgren alongside Adam Fox. This has been a pair that's been around for a couple of years now, with Lindgren sort of embodying the defensive role while Adam Fox can carry the puck as well as he wants and make those first passes out of the zone that he does so well. Adam Fox is going to be your star defenseman for a long time, hopefully, in New York Rangers uniform, so he's right there alongside Lindgren. The second pair, you've got K'Andre Miller, who broke out next season offensively while also maintaining a bit of defensive prowess that he's known for, alongside Jacob Trouba, the captain of the New York Rangers. So this is a nice top four you've got there with Fox and Trouba as the name brand, and then K'Andre Miller as the growing defenseman, and Ryan Lindgren holding the fort down. On the third pair, you've got Braden Schneider, who has taken a few years to develop, but is still sort of a prospect that you're worth mentioning. He's in the last year of his ELC at this point, but he's still been a prominent role on that bottom pair there with Eric Gustafsson, the newcomer, as well as Zach Jones, who I could see crack the lineup as well as another young defenseman. Something to note is that every defenseman aside from Trouba and Gustafsson are 25 years of age or younger. So this is quite the young core to take New York Rangers to the playoffs, so I'll be interested to see how they do throughout the season and the ebbs and flows that young players go through.
And finally, looking at the goalies here, we have one of the elite goalies in the league starting for the New York Rangers, and that is Igor Shesterkin. He won the Vezina 2 years ago, and although wasn't quite as good as that Vezina winning season last year, he was still an elite goaltender in the league, and he's playing behind a pretty solid New York Rangers team. So we're looking for another great year from Igor Shesterkin. To back him up, we have the veteran Jonathan Quick, who brings some great experience, such as in Stanley Cup winning pedigree. Most importantly, won the Cup with Vegas last year, and of course, the LA Kings runs that he had back in the 2010s. He'll be a good backup, although he has fallen off a bit in some recent years, but maybe as a backup position, he can revive his game. And then finally, Louis Dominique, I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know exactly, but he's just a depth piece there.
Moving on from the projected lineup to the storyline surrounding the New York Rangers headed into the 2023-24 season. So the first one here is really going to dictate the entire season for the New York Rangers, and it's whether or not Igor Shesterkin can return to his previous Vezina form. And this is so crucial for this team because, as you saw with Quick and Domingue, they really don't have sufficient backup goaltenders in the system at this point in time. So Shesterkin 2 years ago had a 935 and 2.07 goals against average and won the Vezina, as we said. But last season, he kind of slumped a little bit down to 916 and up in goals against average to 2.48. So still solid, but not at his regular elite level. So it'll be really interesting to see whether or not he's able to return to his form.
I think it's kind of funny that we're talking about a 916 save percentage as it's a bad thing. I mean, that 930 that he posted 2 years ago was just ridiculous. And he really did carry some of these New York Rangers teams into the playoffs and into the second round. So I think we will see a bounce back. I mean, the talent's obviously there. He's Russian. He has that going for him. And it seems like all elite goalies are Russian. So I think he'll definitely have a bounce back season. And I also think the Rangers have gotten better since last year. So there's that going for him as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That he's still definitely in his worst season an above average goaltender in the National Hockey League. But that being said, the New York Rangers expect and hope that he can return to sort of the elite of the league and sort of stay in his own tier alongside the Vasilevskis and other goaltenders that are seen at that top of the league, top of the line. Therefore, he can provide that extra need that is there because of this young decor that I worry about. I'm curious to see if that young decor is going to affect him this season or if he can just sort of hold down the fort and no matter what shots are thrown at him, he'll still stop them.
Yeah, this is a guy who's almost undebatably one of the top three goalies in the league. And it kind of seems like New York has made a really big bet on that fact by bringing in Quick as the backup because I don't really think he can handle much NHL action at this point in time. So they're really going to be relying on Igor Shesterkin to probably get that save percentage back above a 920 at least in that area, I'd say, to really make a deep push in the playoffs. So uh, I think their success completely hinges on him, and as it should when you have one of the elite goalies in the NHL. Moving on to our next storyline, we touched on it briefly during the offensive lines, but just kind of this is starting to become kind of a reoccurring annual question as to whether these players are going to break out or not. And the ones here of interest, particularly, are Alexis Lafrenière and Kaapo Kakko. So just some background on both these players. Lafrenière was drafted first overall in 2020. He's put up 21 points, 31 points, and 39 points across his first three NHL seasons. Kaapo Kakko, on the other hand, was drafted second overall in 2019 behind Jack Hughes, and he's put up 23 points, 17 points, 18 points, and 40 points across his first four seasons in the NHL. So, kind of the common denominator between these two guys is kind of stagnant progression in their numbers for various reasons for both of them, but just really not developing at the rate you would hope as a number one and number two pick.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite like I don't think we can call them busts quite yet. They still are extremely young. That being said, I don't think they will be living up quite to the hype or the expectation of such high draft picks. I mean, first overall, it's just kind of the way you go. Is like you're expecting generational talents like Bedard, McDavid, Matthews, and then you get Lafreniere, who's by no means a terrible NHL player. He certainly has use, but he's not going to be that game-breaking talent that you want with first overall. And same with Kaapo Kakko. Like Jack Hughes went right before him, and look where Jack Hughes is at compared to this guy. So that's obviously got a sting if you're a New York Rangers fan, but there still should be some hope for these guys. They still are young, and there still is some room for them to grow, especially given an increased opportunity, which I think they should be put into this season.
Yeah, And the draft backstory for both of these guys is pretty crazy when you think about it. In 2019, Kaapo Kakko was coming off an amazing international play where he played at the World Championships, he played at the World Juniors, he played in Europe in Liga, and also in like the younger leagues as well. And he just performed everywhere he played. He was dynamic, he was fast, he was able to play a bit of defense as well when he needed to. Like he was at least aware on the ice and very able to accommodate all of the other players on the team, despite Finland not being the top team in all of those divisions. And then, so he was notably the top 2 pick at that draft. Looking back to 2019, it was him or Hughes, and Hughes went first. He went second. There really wasn't anybody contending for that top 2. The following picks were Kirby Doc, Bowen Byram, Alex Turcotte, Moritz Seider, Dylan Cousins. So a pretty mixed bag when you think about it. Some players that, in hindsight, you'd want to have are possibly Dylan Cousins is probably the highlight of that pack.
Mo Seider too.
And Mo Seider as well. Yep. And then looking to 2020, Lafrenière was pretty much the consensus number 1 overall pick at the time. It might have been between him, Byfield, and Stützle. And a scout that I was talking to as the draft was going on told me Tim Stützle might be the best player out of this whole draft at the time in 2020 while the draft was happening. And he gets drafted 3rd overall at Ottawa. And looking back 3 years later, I think that scout hit the nail on the head right there. That was a pretty nice prediction there. Obviously, you really hope for everybody to do well. But Tim Stützle has really grown into a dynamic offensive option, while Lafrenière has taken a long time to develop, despite being seemingly already ready after putting up crazy numbers in the QMJHL. So I'm really curious to see which of these prospects is given up on first. Kaapo Kakko being 1 year older, having his contract expire this year, he is arbitration eligible as an RFA, while Lafrenière is not in 2 years' time. So we'll see what happens this offseason upcoming, but this is a huge year for Kaapo Kakko specifically for his contract year, and a huge year for Alexis Lafrenière to keep developing and keep putting the effort in to try to become the player both these guys were supposed to be.
Yeah, I really think what it all comes down to is simply opportunity. Because to me, if you transplant Lafrenière into the same situation Stützle was in, who knows? Maybe he'd be just as good as Stützle is today. Like, we will never know. But what it really comes down to is guys like Byfield and Lafrenière ended up on teams that weren't rebuilding so much as retooling around a core that they have. Like, it's kind of crazy that New York even ended up with the 1st overall pick that year, because I think they just barely missed the playoffs. So with the new draft lottery system, that wouldn't even be possible. And I think, honestly, New York getting Lafrenière kind of is one of the things that led to that happening, because it wasn't really seen as fair that a team that just barely missed the playoffs was able to get a very highly touted number 1 overall pick. And to me, it comes down to the New York Rangers have squandered these players to this point in their career by not giving them enough opportunity and going out at the deadline, constantly bringing in big names and kind of ruining I guess, the fabric of this team and the chemistry of this team to go and get the big name, when really they should have been focusing on internal development and turning these guys into top 6 players to play with Panarin and Kreider and the guys they have there. So I really think they've kind of missed the boat here.
Yeah, that kind of seems like a theme with the New York Rangers. And one other point I want to bring up is how important these two are to the New York Rangers, like success in the long run. But like we saw 2 years ago in the playoffs when we had the kid line between these two, and then Filipino centering them, brought them to the second round with a Game 7 win over the Pittsburgh Penguins. And then we look to last year where they fell short in the first round to the New Jersey Devils. And that kid line 2 years ago was one of the best lines in the playoffs for the Rangers. And then, as you mentioned, Cam, they brought in Tarasenko and Kane in this past year's deadline, and that may have thrown off these two, so they lost their game a bit in the playoffs, and they weren't able to get over to the hump. So just some more food for thought there. I think these two will be extremely important to the New York Rangers moving forward, if they will develop or not.
Yeah, and you look at the trajectory of the team as well. This is a team that wants to just compete now every year, which is why those moves were made. But at the same time, you have to compete long term. I think of a team like Tampa Bay Lightning, who are trying to hold on to whatever they have asset-wise from their prospects. They're trying to do that, but they also want to win another cup. And the New York Rangers have not won a cup in a long time. They are really hoping to get over that hump and win a cup, but they also don't want to screw up the rest of their development of these guys like Lafrenière and Kakko, other guys like Braden Schneider, Niels Lundqvist traded to Dallas. They've got Zach Jones still on the extras now for the defense core. These are guys that should be developing. They're already getting to the ages of 21, 22, a couple years now into their development, and they still haven't reached what people are expecting or hoping out of them. So that's unfortunate because you kind of hope that either New York wins the cup or these guys are fully developed and like a huge part to this movement in New York.
Yeah, I think they really dropped the ball kind of because as you said, Nick, like I don't think they should have been going all out for the cup the past couple years when they should have been focusing on developing these guys because they kind of messed up the timing, in my opinion. Because if you had really focused on developing these guys in the first 2, 3 years of their career, then they'd ideally be coming into a really strong part of their career. And then you still have them. Well, you have these guys like Panarin and Fox who are still at almost the height of their powers, but it seems like they've delayed these guys' development and they're going to miss the prime of Panarin and Fox essentially. And they're going to just kind of be screwed at the end of it. So it's really unfortunate. I think they've really mismanaged these young players, and it's to the point where anytime a player gets drafted to the New York Rangers, I almost feel sorry for them because it just seems like they're incapable of developing their own players. Like pretty much all of their impact players at this point are imports from other teams. So hopefully these guys can kind of flip the script and change that narrative. But for me, a guy like Lafreniere in particular, I mean, you saw the projected lineups. I think Kaapo Kakko is going to have a bit more opportunity this year just by virtue of he plays on the right side. Lafreniere is a guy, if he's slotted in on the third line again, I'd love to see him get a change of scenery and go to a new team because this is a guy whose game I loved to watch when he was in the World Juniors. In the playoff games I've seen him play, he's just super exciting to watch. He's a high energy guy who's always in the thick of the action on the ice, and it's just really unfortunate he hasn't been able to get to off to the strong start that he probably would have if he had have gone to a different team. But we'll have to see how these two perform this year, and hopefully this is the year that we stop asking whether these guys are breakout players. Moving on to our final storyline, and to be honest, not much of a legitimate storyline, but something interesting to talk about. So we're going to talk about it nonetheless. But basically, a guy at the Hockey News named Matthew Mugno wrote an article, basically, I guess, hypothetically wondering whether or not Steven Stamkos would make sense as a trade deadline target for the New York Rangers. So before you turn off the video and turn off your device, I'll explain his rationale, and it is an interesting thought experiment at the bare minimum. So basically, this would only happen if Tampa came out of the gate and significantly struggled at the beginning of the season due to the recent injury to Andre Vasilevsky. He's going to be out for 2 months to 10 weeks. So it is possible that if they don't address their goaltending, they could seriously struggle at the beginning of the year. So if that's the case and Tampa is not doing well, not in the playoff picture uh, by the deadline, which again, can't stress enough, is highly unlikely. But if that's the case, it could make sense to somewhat retool around the core that they have of Hedman, Kucherov, Point, Sergachev, and Andre Vasilevsky. And based on the recent comments of GM Brisebois, it sounds like Stamkos might not be considered part of that integral core to the team. It sounds like he'd be a nice have, but not a must have compared to some of these other names. So all these guys are under 32 years of age right now, whereas Stamkos is 33, pushing 34. And as I just mentioned, there's been some controversy recently over the contract extension for Steven Stamkos. He publicly came out and said that he's upset about it. So there's where there's smoke, there's fire sometimes, and who knows? You guys have any thoughts on this kind of outlandish but very interesting
Yeah,
trade rumor, in my
it's
opinion?
outlandish for a reason, Cam. It's I really don't think it's happening. Uh, does Stamkos have a no move clause? Do you guys know? I can
Not
pull that
sure.
up. Maybe to put you on the spot, but if he does, the only way he's gonna move is if he asks for it, even as like captain. There's no way they're gonna just trade him just as a rental to another team just for what, a couple picks, or I guess you could maybe get some intriguing returns. Stamkos is a great player, But that's your captain that you're talking about. I don't think Stamkos or even Brisebois would even think
Well,
about moving him.
it's funny you bring up that he's a captain because these are two teams, sorry, that have a well-established recent history of trading captains amongst each other. Ryan Callahan many years ago was traded from New York to the Tampa Bay Lightning. He was the captain of New York at the time. Ryan McDonough was traded from the Rangers to the Lightning as well while he was captain. And years before that, Martin St. Louis was traded from the Tampa Bay Lightning to the New York Rangers when he was captain. So it's kind of just an interesting history there as well. And to think that Stamkos could be the fourth is just, to me, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't think those previous trades really hold any weight for me. Like, well, they're probably different GMs. It's like many years have passed since then, so that's just like bringing up some stats from the past. I really think this is outlandish, and it's quite frankly, I don't think it's ever going to happen.
Yeah, it's a fun idea when you're on GM mode personally, but it's real life we're talking about here. Stamkos has a no movement clause in the last year of his $8.5 million
Yeah,
contract, alongside guys like Point, Kucherov. Nick Paul has a no trade clause, and Connor Sheary actually has a no trade clause. So these are guys that they believe this specific year are going to be on their team. Stamkos wouldn't waive his clause, as if we remember back to when he was a free agent and people thought he was going to go to the Toronto Maple Leafs, he then signed his giant deal with Tampa and stayed in Tampa despite being from the Toronto area. He didn't want to go home. He wanted to stay with the Lightning. He's now won 2 cups, and he's competing with the best of the best. He's playing on a line with Braden Point and Nikita Kucherov. I don't think he wants to come to the New York Rangers and try to fit in somewhere, maybe as a right winger instead of Kaapo Kakko. I don't think he's going to get enough puck touches to be worth it to come to New York. I think he's happy with his family, especially at that age, being at 33. At this point, I think he wants to enjoy his house in Tampa and stay with the Lightning. And he's just a guy that I just can't see wanting to waive it for the New York Rangers. I think Tampa's in a better spot despite the Vasilevsky injury.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be the first one to say I definitely don't think a trade at the deadline is going to happen at all. The one thing I do find a little bit more interesting though is if extension talks fall through with Stamkos, and we'll get into it more in the Bay video, which is coming up. But I would definitely see New York as a possible destination if things were to fall through in Tampa and he's looking as a free agent for somewhere to sign. There's a couple more teams that we'll probably get into in that video where he might be interested in, but uh, he definitely going to be looking to win a Stanley Cup, and the Rangers are a team that I think he'd seamlessly fit into. So, as far as the trade rumors go that were mentioned by the Hockey News writer, don't think that's going to happen. Definitely don't. Interesting thought experiment, but uh, what will be interesting, really interesting, is if the contract talks fall through, then the rumors will really start to swirl about where he's going to go, and New York could be one of those places.
Yeah, one more thing to quickly add is that if the New York Rangers somehow pursued Steven Stamkos and acquired him, it reminds us exactly of what happened last year to the previous storyline about
Yeah,
Lafrenière and Kakko getting pushed down the lineup for limited playing time to again negatively affect their development. So that would be another unfortunate incident for those two guys.
yeah,
yeah, and you also saw with Patrick Kane, too many cooks in the kitchen. So I wonder if Stamkos would just go through the exact same thing if they tried to acquire him at the deadline and not in the offseason.
yeah. I definitely think one of the underlying reasons why this piece was written, though, is I do think there is possibly a hole in that top six on the right side if Kaapo Kakko isn't able to take a step this year like we're hoping he will. So it's definitely a team to look out for at the trade deadline and, like I said, in free agency as well. So it's going to be a spot they're going to be looking to address as well as possibly the backup role if Jonathan Quick fizzles out as well. So those will be some holes that this team might be looking to fill. And I believe they still have all their first round picks as we went through. So definitely could be some interesting trade rumors to come out of New York in the months to come. Moving on to our final segment here, we're just going to go over a broad overview of the offseason and the upcoming season for the New York Rangers. So in terms of the offseason grade, I'm going to give them a B plus because I just think that Blake Wheeler trade is a stroke of genius. Sorry, Blake Wheeler signing is a stroke of genius. To get a guy who had nearly 40 assists into your team at an $800,000 cap hit is just incredible. He's almost a direct replacement for Patrick Kane, or at least the level we saw Patrick Kane at last year. So I think that was just an incredible piece of business. It was obvious you were going to lose Kane, Tarasenko, all those guys. There was nothing they could do to prevent that. But to bring in guys like Bonino, Gustafson, and Blake Wheeler around the fringes, around $800,000 is really good business. In terms of offensive strength, going to be a B plus. Couple holes in that lineup. Maybe a guy like Jimmy Vesey is playing a bit too high, but outside of that, pretty solid lineup. As we said, might want to address that top six right wing spot and push Blake Wheeler down into that Jimmy Vesey role. But B plus is fair there. In terms of defensive strength, this is a very solid decor. As Nick said, a little bit young and inexperienced, so that's going to dock them a little bit. But a B plus there, I think, is fair as well. And then in terms of goaltending, this is a team with a top three goalie in the NHL, so that's going to be an A plus. Not really weighed down by Jonathan Quick. I think that Shesterkin is going to take on the lion's share of the workload here and will probably have great results. So in terms of the future outlook, it's going to be an A minus. This is a team that has some interesting prospects, as we saw, all their first round picks, and they still have some young players on the roster who are at the bare minimum intriguing, and at the best, their potential is tantalizing. So we'll have to see how Lafrenière and Kaapo Kakko work out, but going to be an A minus in terms of the future outlook.
And looking at our projected Eastern Conference standings, we have the Rangers finishing third in the Metro, so pretty easily in a playoff spot there. But this team is 1 year older to an already aging core. You have Panarin, Kreider, Zibanejad, who are getting older. And we saw the Rangers get exposed by the younger and faster Devils in the first round last year. So just wonder if they'll be able to keep up. But when you have goaltending like Shesterkin and some young dynamic pieces like Fox, they're really the star power is there to get them through for sure.
Moving on to our final graphic, just going over the individual rankings we had for the New York Rangers. Nick had them finishing 9th overall. Noel had them finishing 9th overall as well. And I had them finishing 8th overall. We all had them making the playoffs, and the aggregate standing was 9th overall in the NHL. So not really much difference there, not much to get into. Just going to be another good season for New York Rangers fans. Very excited to see what they do at the deadline. This is a team that always adds, maybe to the detriment of some of their younger players, but at least it'll give us stuff to talk about. So at the bare minimum.
One more thing to add, Cam. I don't think we mentioned it in the video yet. They do have a new head coach. Gallant left in the offseason. They have Laviolette now, the former Washington Capitals coach. So we'll see if that injects some new life into this team or if it is to their detriment.
Mr. Metropolitan, they call him.
Yeah.
He's coached the Flyers, the Capitals, the Rangers, a bunch of teams in the Metropolitan. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Really appreciate all the support thus far. Make sure to tune in to the next video, and please like, comment, and subscribe.